I'm Dr. G, and I'm very super excited. Now COVID has made us get virtual, which means in a way that we can even hit everybody all across the world, you know? So I'm super excited to kind of have some conversation with our guest today. I've been bragging to everybody that she's my own personal special needs attorney. It can't get better than that. To me, it's like somebody who knows I think your CPA, your attorney, your doctor, they know certain things that you're like, boy, you want to make sure that your whole life is being viewed by this person. You want to be able to say, that's somebody I can trust with my life. And this person it's going to be with us this afternoon, truly, she's an amazing woman. I've had the privilege of being close and up and close with her. We traveled to Ghana, West Africa. So that just tells you, and we also did Liberia. How could I forget?
A quick Liberia while we were there.
Yes, we did Liberia while we were in Ghana. I made a jet, just to tell you that when you get to connect with some people in your life, and I'll share another piece of the story about her life when we get to talk in a minute. But I want to welcome all our Facebook friends who are joining us. This is a very important topic, and it hits the heart of many of us, and it hits my heart personally. So when I reached out to my good friend Hillary Freeman, who is an attorney, and she said, yes, I'll do the support group. So for those of us who don't know, we typically host our monthly support group every second Sunday of the month. In the past, we've done it physically. Hillary has spoken to us in the past also, and in this time, in this season, I really wanted her to kind of share some of the issues that we're facing. And the reason why I'm absolutely excited about this woman is the fact that she helped me through the guardianship process for Nicholas last year. And last year was one of those years in my journey on this special needs journey where I really felt like I didn't have it all together. And not that I'm saying that I have it together all the time. I'm just saying that there's just some seasons that you just know that if you don't have the people that keep you grounded, you're just going to fall apart in front of everybody. And I remember during our travel, she was able to share with me some of the things she did with her brother. And that really, really, really inspired me and encouraged me. And so when I say to you that there are some people who God brings into your life, and so Hillary, God brought you into my life for so many reasons. And what's also interesting about her is that her mom is a social worker. And
retired, but
yes. Retired, right? Okay. Well, she's always going to be my personal social worker too, because when we first completed early intervention, so for those who may not know, when you first get the diagnosis from up to the age of 3, your child is in early intervention, and then when they turn 3, within the district that you go in, you're in school. And so the school that I ended up in was Brunswick Acres in South Brunswick, New Jersey. And Hillary's mom happens to be the social worker. Now, I didn't connect the two. Of course, I would have remembered the last name, Susan Freeman. And the reason why she comes to my memory is that she's the one that told me about DCF and DDD and Perform Care and getting connected to resources right from day one. And so I got this diagnosis. I was overwhelmed. I was traumatized. I didn't know where I'm going, to my left or to my right. And God just used this woman to say, hey, by the way, XYZ. Now, I didn't know at the time that she had her own son, right? So obviously, as a parent and also as a professional, she knew the value of people being connected to resources right from the beginning. So I look back now, and it's now 16 years later, and I still remember her. That's how powerful it is that somebody can just give you a nugget and that changes your whole trajectory. And so for us, Nicholas has been able to receive the resources and the support that he's needed because God has placed people in my life who's helped me. Years later, I connected with a BCBA who you guys have met. My other absolutely favorite person, Rebecca Ziguez, who's so fantastic. So Rebecca, became Nicholas's behavioral therapist, BCBA, board certified behavioral analyst. And, Rebecca is the one that somehow mentioned Hillary to me, and I was just like, here we go again. And actually, before Rebecca even mentioned, I didn't even know how close friends they were. Another BCBA is like, I know an absolutely fantastic attorney, special ed attorney that you should talk to. And so I invited Hillary to come do a talk for us, with my goal. And then kind of bring it back together is when we were talking, and she's like, oh yeah, my mom used to be at Brothers Bakers. And I was like, oh my God, that's your mother. So I'm just like, so I just wanted to share that people who come in our lives that mean a lot to us. And so I'm so grateful to you and your mom. So please tell Miss Freeman that I said hello. And
well, thank you.
Tell him that Nicholas is much bigger. He's like almost 5'9" now, and all of us are like, okay, so I won't put my children and Senna and Delali and I, we're a little on the vertically challenged side, and I know Hillary.
I use that phrase all the time.
So I just share that to say that we really have an amazing speaker with us today. So I want to say hello to all my friends, and Lilia, thank you for joining in. I see Adiranke, thank you for joining. Sean, welcome for coming in. I just want to welcome all of you for being here today, because this is really going to be a fun topic. Hillary Freeman is an attorney, and like I said to all of you guys, she is somebody that I trust with my own personal son's issues. And when we were getting to the place of needing guardianship, because we need to advocate for Nicholas, I was able to turn to her, and she walked us through that process seamlessly. And so I'm very grateful for her being here today. She's going to talk about some of the hot topics in special ed today in the era of COVID, a little bit about her. If you want to look her up, freemanlawoffices.com. You can just Google that right now and you see her information. I'll just read a little bit about her bio. That's right off of her website. Hillary Freeman is deeply committed to her work representing people with disabilities and their family. As a sister of a man with autism and a national speaker in special education matters, she's able to combine personal experience with her legal training to help families advocate for services and supports. She has experience representing clients in special education and Section 504 issues, higher education issues, including accommodations on high-stake testing, graduate school admission tests, guardianship matters, estate planning, adult services. I mean, this woman is, you can go on and on and on about her, but she is the real deal, people. Like, there's just some people that you meet that just like real. They keep it real. So I just love that about you, Hillary. And, I've worked with multiple different special needs attorneys. So it's not like, I have a bias. Yes, I do. But I can also tell you that there's some fine attorneys out there, but at this time, there's someone that I know gets it, and she gets you families watching. And so she's here to kind of open it up and she'll share. And we'll take some of the questions at the end, and I'll welcome Hillary Freeman at this time. So Jenny, you can put the spotlight on her.
Genevieve, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I really have I've been so lucky to get to know you over the years, especially having the fortunate and amazing opportunity to go to Ghana and see your work in Ghana, and then do the presentation with you in Liberia. You were just phenomenal. I mean, I've just been watching you and just in awe. You've been amazing, and I really just want to thank you for everything that you've done to help the community. Your presentations are phenomenal. I really just, you're amazing. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Hillary. Thank you for being here.
Of course. So thank you everyone for joining. My name is Hillary Freeman from Freeman Law Offices. We have offices around New Jersey, in Princeton, Freehold, and Summit, New Jersey. But now in the wake of COVID, we are taking everything virtual, including court appearances. I have a trial scheduled tomorrow for all week. It's going to be over Zoom. So everything is proceeding as normal, just with the exception of we're doing Zoom hearings and Zoom video conferences. So just to make sure everything moves forward and nothing is stopped. We started, today is about hot topics in special education during COVID-19. And this presentation is coming at a very interesting time. I did a lot of these presentations in the beginning when everybody was home and virtual instruction was starting. And the laws and regulations were changing almost every day. New executive orders were coming out. And it was almost every day because schools weren't doing things. And then we were fighting and working with the governor to try to get new orders to make sure that the schools implemented home instruction and implemented it to kids with special needs as to the maximum extent that they could on a virtual basis. So now we're at a funny point, and I think it's a really great time to talk about what's going to happen now. You've all been home with your children. Some of you have been providing the education to your children since March, or late March, early April. And we are in a situation now where there's conversation. The governor just came out with guidance or an order the other day that said schools can open with appropriate and with if they can implement the certain measures for extended school year, and they will likely go back to school in September. So what does that mean for you? Well, this entire time, since we've been on home instruction, but officially in New Jersey since April 1st, school districts have been required to implement the federal regulations of the IDEA in Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. That hasn't changed. The federal government said that they were required to do that to the maximum extent that they could. And the plan was, and the entire time the plan was that the school districts had an obligation to provide services to the maximum extent that they could, with an understanding that when students return to school, the IEP team would convene to provide to see what compensatory education was about, and whether the student was entitled to compensatory education. So today I'm going to be talking about what schools should have done during this time and how do you determine whether compensatory education is due. I can pretty much assure you that compensatory education is due for everyone. Unfortunately, I'm sure, I think a lot of teachers did not, I don't think anyone really expected that students would really make progress during this time. I think that it was their hope, but I don't think they ever really expected students to make progress. I think their hope was really to maintain the progress that they have made, and sincere hope that they didn't regress during this time. I know for students with autism, there are various levels of, it's a spectrum disorder. My brother is autistic. He is 47 years old, and he's nonverbal. Cognitively, he's a 3-year-old. But he's in a group home, and he is doing the best that he can there. But he is obviously the more severe end of the spectrum, and there are obviously students who are less severely impacted that also struggled from this. For those of you who had children who could not sit in front of a computer during this time, you might want to look back to, I'm going to just talk about compensatory education for a little bit, and then I'll go into the rest of the regulations. But you might want to go back to your IEPs, and to the extent that you had any notebooks going back and forth to your teachers, emails, you might want to go back to those records that were going back and forth between you and the teachers before this happened, right before this happened, to see how your child was performing at that time. And you might want to compare that to where your child is now, because the next step is to ask for an IEP meeting to discuss where your child is performing, and how are you going to get your child back to a level where they should be at this time. We'll also talk about another hot topic, which is ESY. If your school is open up for ESY, does it look bad upon you as parents not to send your children if you don't feel comfortable? You certainly can. If your child is eligible and you feel comfortable, that is perfectly fine. But a lot of parents are asking questions, what happens if you don't feel comfortable? And then again, same thing for September. What happens if schools open up and you don't feel comfortable sending your child? So that's what we'll get into today. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I'm going to do my best to do that. Hold on one second, because I have a PowerPoint. I have asked that if you do have any questions and you put it in the chat, send it to Jenny Soto. You can send it to me, but I have a hard time seeing the chat room when my PowerPoint is up. So if you send it to Jenny, she'll read out the question for you during this time. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the top, hold on one second. Okay. You can see it still?
Yes, we can
Okay,
see it.
thank you. Okay. So to start out with the agenda, like I had mentioned, we're going to be talking about what the district's obligations are under the IDEA in Section 504. The IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That's the federal law that governs special education. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is often viewed as less serious, but in fact, it gives you more rights than the IDEA, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But that is essentially an anti-discrimination statute that we'll get into in detail in a few minutes. What were the district's obligations to provide FAPE during COVID-19? Evaluations, reevaluations, IEPs, and challenging the school district in the event you're not happy with if you can't come to an agreement with what your child should be receiving to receive FAPE or benefit from their education. So Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, I had mentioned before, and many of you probably are aware that if you Google Section 504, it's viewed as maybe just an accommodation statute. But in my view, it is actually way more serious than just an accommodation statute. It's an anti-discrimination statute that came out before the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And it's an anti-discrimination statute that says that no other qualified individual with a disability shall solely by reason of her disability be excluded from the participation in, denied the benefits of, or subject to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So in this particular case, what we're talking about here is obviously their entitlement to education. You're looking at what are our neurotypically developing students getting, what type of education are they getting, what services are they getting, what are districts addressing, so what topic areas are they addressing. I'm sure that they're addressing social skills, I'm sure that they're addressing academics and behaviors just like they should be for students with special needs. And the reason that I know that is because those are the skills that are necessary to teach a child to be as independent as possible when they graduate from high school at 18, 19, 20, or 21. So if you're not sure, if you don't believe me that school districts are teaching those skills to neurotypically developing students, look at the core curriculum content standards. You can Google it, they're readily available, and you can see that in those standards, you will see the type of education that everybody should be getting. Those are the skills that say that were written after a bunch of experts got together and said that these are the skills that are necessary to be successful in the post-secondary environment. So the core curriculum content standards everybody should be entitled to an education to meet those standards in all of those different areas there. And so that includes, and that should be geared towards gen ed students, neurotypically developing students, and students with disabilities. If your child is not getting access to that education, that's a violation of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. That's discrimination. Okay, they're saying that the argument is that gen ed students are getting this education, my child should be getting it too. In the case of COVID-19, a lot of students who are gen ed were getting education. Because they could sit in front of a computer. They didn't have issues. They weren't nervous. They weren't wondering why the person that they usually see in their teacher was on the screen instead of a cartoon character. I had clients who really had a difficult time with this in the beginning because they were really confused. Why is their parent all of a sudden teaching them instruction or giving them the instruction? Why all of a sudden is their teacher on the screen when they were seeing cartoon characters before or games? It can be scary. And also, why all of a sudden were they in school and suddenly the next day they're not seeing their peers? So they were having a lot of difficulty sitting in front of a computer for multiple reasons, and those were just a few of them. So they weren't getting an education during this time. So that means that later on, the school districts are going to have to make up for it to make sure that they get the education that they otherwise were entitled to during this time. If you haven't done this already, I would encourage you to revisit the IEP. If your child is going to likely be home for for extended school year, or if next year, and they're having trouble sitting in front of a computer, I would highly encourage you to add a goal to the IEP to teach them skills to sit in front of a computer, and then so they can access their education ultimately. It might not be right away, but there are pairing activities that they could do that would be overseen probably by a board certified behavioral analyst, where they can teach them to sit in front of a computer. If you haven't done that already, and your child will likely be on virtual instruction for an extended period of time, I would encourage you to add a goal to, if that's an issue for you, or if that's difficult. So under Section 504, just to illustrate that it's not just an accommodation statute. These are the powerful points that come out of it. And I would encourage you to take screenshots of this if you haven't, or a picture of some kind if you haven't already. Because what this is saying is that school districts are required to make reasonable modifications to policies, practices, or procedures if necessary to avoid discrimination. So one example would be if they had a policy that they were only giving out Chromebooks, and there's another computer that's faster and the Chromebook didn't work, because you couldn't maybe download videos. They would need to make modifications to the policy to enable your child to get access to the same videos at the same pace. They might need to provide if they were providing handouts to some students, and that was their policy, that they're providing handouts to gen ed students, but your child maybe can't read, or they benefit from one-on-one instruction or face-to-face interaction, they would have to modify their policy or practice to make sure that your child can get access to their education. That Section 504 also says, and this is a really key point, it's a lot of people think that they can't get special education and related aids and services under Section 504. They can, and this is a statement that comes right out of Section 504 that says that that they are entitled to those services in order to to address their educational needs as adequately as non-disabled students are receiving it. So that is a pretty powerful point. And one thing to keep in mind under this is that if your child is eligible for an IEP, they're automatically entitled to the protections under Section 504. You don't need a separate plan, a Section 504 plan to receive these services. That you can combine it into one document, into an IEP, but I just want you to be aware that Section 504 does have statements in there to ensure that your child is getting enough services and supports to give them equal access to their education as their neurotypically developing peers. It also talks about that students are entitled to placement in the least restrictive environment. So if the least restrictive environment is virtual instruction during this time, so be it. If it is as in an environment with neurotypically developing peers, wonderful. If the school is saying, and I have a feeling that this is going to be a big issue for extended school year, if school districts are providing extended school year virtually, but your child isn't accessing the information virtually because they can't sit in front of a computer, or they're not benefiting from the virtual instruction, you might have a very strong argument to get services in a clinic. If there's an ABA clinic or any type of speech and language clinic, social skills clinic, if you can find a clinic that is providing in-person instruction and you're okay with your child going there, and that would be a really good argument to make for the school district to pay for that clinic over the summer if they're not providing the instruction in person, because it would be the least restrictive environment for your child. So that's a pretty key point. That would be under Section 504 and also under the IDEA. Teachers, parents, you're not allowed to be, districts are not allowed to retaliate against you for advocating for your child. Your child can advocate for themselves. Districts cannot retaliate against you. Teachers, you can retaliate. You can advocate for a student, and your boss or supervisor is not allowed to retaliate against you for taking that position. Same thing for parents. And then the last really powerful point is that if it is determined that a district did discriminate against your child, you would be entitled to damages. And it's not always intentional discrimination that would give you an entitlement to damages. It could be deliberate indifference, which means that they just knew about it and they didn't do anything about it. They didn't care. So that's how I would approach that under these circumstances. You would be entitled to damages under Section 504 if your child did not get equal access to their education and they otherwise should have. Any questions so far?
No.
Okay.
No.
Thank you for that. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it says that to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free and appropriate public education, that's FAPE. This is the purpose of the IDEA. That is to ensure that all children with disabilities have access to FAPE. That emphasizes special education and related services is designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So with that, you're thinking about what skills do they need to have to be successful in the post-secondary environment. They don't care what level of functioning they're at. There are going to be skills that they can learn to be more independent. And I don't want to hear that the students can't learn. If they've learned one thing, that means they can learn. It's just identifying how they learn best. Okay, so if they've learned one thing at all, just one, that means they have the ability to learn. They have the ability to learn other skills. I'll give you an example that happened personally to me and last week. My brother has been in the hospital because he broke his leg. He had surgery 2 weeks ago and he broke his leg. Well, he was after his surgery, the physical therapist came in and said, and he's nonverbal, and the physical therapist didn't know what to do with him. So she said, he really doesn't have the ability to transfer on his own. But I knew he did, and so did my family, because he's learned other things aside from the fact that he's been in therapy many times and he's learned these skills. So we knew that he did, but the physical therapist just assumed that because he was pretty severely impacted, he wouldn't have the ability to learn how to transfer from his bed to his wheelchair. And don't you know, a few days later, he was transferring to his wheelchair. We just got another physical therapist who was willing to work with him. I'm not going to say it's always easy. It's not. But if you have a good teacher or a motivated teacher and a good board certified behavioral analyst, together you can identify how your child learns, and then you can teach them skills to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So you're looking at social skills, speech and language. So social skills are turn taking, expressive language, receptive language, pragmatics, understanding how another person is feeling, how they might be interpreting a situation, maybe the appropriate ways to act in various environments, maybe how to address their own anxiety, because if they have autism, they likely have a high sense of anxiety. You want to figure out the best way of addressing their anxiety. If they're going to college, there are skills that they need to learn to be on a college campus, to navigate a college campus. School districts have an obligation to teach that, in addition to being involved in a relationship. So we're not just talking about academics here, we're talking about social skills, emotional development, and functional life skills as well. Learning to take showers every day, or trying to get in a routine of taking showers every day. Washing their clothes and not wearing the same clothes every day, unless they're in there working from home and never leaving, like they have been for the past few months. But these are skills that, proper hygiene is an important area to address in your child's IEP, and school districts have an obligation to teach that. If you're having trouble in the home environment, schools districts can send people to your home to teach your child skills in that environment. It's not limited to the school environment. They can come to your home to teach your child skills in the home. They can take your child out into the community to teach skills out in the community. So these are all areas that I would really encourage you to make sure that your child's IEP is addressing. And if it's not, then maybe have an IEP meeting. It can be done virtually. It could be done over the summer if you want. You should have an IEP meeting to make sure that these areas are covered in the IEP. So when we're talking about what is FAPE, there's this decision came out in 2017, and this is essentially the decision from the Supreme Court that defines what appropriate means. So FAPE is free and appropriate public education. Everybody knows what free is. You know, you don't have to pay for an education. That's public funds that are paying for providing your education. Appropriate is really the term that everybody is always arguing about, and we'll get into the standard in a minute. Public is at public expense, and education is the ability to learn. So your child is entitled to a free and appropriate public education. Excuse me. So then the question is, what is appropriate? Well, the Supreme Court came out and said that this is the standard for what is appropriate. A school must offer an IEP that's reasonably calculated to enable your child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. This is huge, okay? In light of the child's circumstances. For your children, if I keep on going back to right now, virtual instruction. If they are not able to progress currently because they can't benefit from their virtual instruction, then those are the circumstances where the school district needs to take steps to make sure your child is provided with services to enable them to make progress, to access and benefit from their education. So they might need to provide extra instruction over the summer. They might need to contract with private providers to come into your home if you're okay with that. They might need to contract with private providers to come into the home and provide an education, or they might need to, under these circumstances, now that the governor said you can open up the school building under certain circumstances, then they might need to make arrangements for your child to come into the school. Or maybe their extended school year program is not appropriate for your child because maybe it's addressing reading and math and science when your child really needs help in behavior management or social skills. So you shouldn't be forced to send your child to an extended school year focusing on math and science and reading if that's not their primary issue. If they otherwise need help in maybe they have sensory needs or they need help with their language, and then the school district would need to make accommodations or provide services to enable your child to get the instruction that he or she requires. So these are just different arguments that you could make. The school district has an obligation to provide FAPE. For your child, that FAPE is, you look to what your child's circumstances are and you look to what their needs are and what conditions they learn best in which they can access their education. And then the school district has to provide that. If they can provide an alternative that meets your child's needs, then it's a question of which one, whether it will really meet your child's needs, that might be appropriate. But otherwise, if they can't find anything or provide a service that will meet your child's needs and there is something that's available, there would be a really good argument that you would have for the school district to pay for that. And then you also look to when you're looking at whether FAPE is provided, you're looking at the adequacy of the given IEP, and you look at the unique circumstances for which of the child for whom it was created. Each IEP should be constructed only after careful consideration of the child's present levels of achievement, disability, and potential for growth. That's a lot. Okay, I'm going to give you a minute to digest that because it is a lot of information, a lot of words. What is that saying? Look to the present levels. The present levels are usually in the beginning of your child's IEP. Hopefully it's comprehensive. Okay. And it really identifies what your child could and could not do when the IEP was written. Okay. Whether they can count to 10, whether they were working on counting to 20, whether they engaged in self-stimulatory behaviors. You really want to, whether they could speak, whether they could, if they had an iPad to communicate, whether they were using the iPad and what circumstances they were using it, whether they were toilet trained, whether they could navigate a school building. You want to look into what were your child's present levels of achievement. Okay, so that's usually written in the beginning of the IEP. If it wasn't comprehensive enough, that's when you go back to the emails and the books that were going back and forth between you and the teacher to really try to identify where your child was when you went on virtual instruction. I highly encourage you, if you haven't done this already, contact the district BCBA and ask for the data that was collected. Ask for it now. Okay, email your BCBAs and ask for the data. You're entitled to it. Ask for the raw data. Don't just ask for the charts. Okay, so you should ask for the raw data, which is the data that was collected in the individual markings of what skills your child was working on and where they were at the time you went home on virtual instruction. Email them, do it during this presentation, I don't care. Email them and request the data. If it's Rethink Data, which is a program that's used for often to teach students, if it's VB-MAP, I don't care, ask for the data. Is there a question?
Yeah, we have a couple.
Okay.
The first is, what is the explanation for appropriately ambitious with regard to the Andrew F?
What is the explanation? So you mean the argument for appropriately ambitious? And so that's a really good question. When I don't know if what your child's IQ is, so there's a misnomer that if a child has a low IQ, that means that they cannot learn. So you really would, and that's not accurate at all. And I have tons of cases and personal experiences where I can prove otherwise. So when you're looking at what's appropriately ambitious, you want to look to where is your child and what are you looking for them to achieve within a year's time frame. Okay, if you're not sure where your child is performing, then they should be doing some sort of an assessment like the peak assessment to identify what skills your child has and what's a reasonable skill that everybody believes they should be able to achieve in a year. You don't want to lower the bar and say they could only count, they're going to learn to count 2 numbers within a year's time frame. You can say once, it depends on your child's needs, but if you think based on past experience that your child should be able to advance maybe 2 or 3 levels or 4 levels by the end of a school after a year, then that's what ambitious is. Okay, you want to raise the bar. You don't want to lower it just because they have a disability. You want to raise the bar and make sure that there are enough services and supports to get them to achieve that goal. Did that answer the question?
So she came back and said that her issue is sort of on the flip side. The child's IQ is 128, but significant defects in social and adaptive, and they're often disregarded needs because the IQ is high.
Oh, in that case, then appropriately ambitious, are they? So I have a lot of follow-up questions to that. So I'm just going to identify factors that I would look to. Where is the child placed? Are they placed in a more self-contained setting because of their social skills deficits? If so, then I would go back to them and ask them what evidence do they have to suggest that your child cannot learn these skills. So I would put the burden on them to prove that with the right services, your child can make progress. So I would.
That the child will be mainstreamed with a 2-to-1 aid next year.
Okay, but does the IEP address the social skills?
She hasn't gotten back to me yet. We can move on to another one while she's getting back to me, if that's easier.
And if she feels comfortable, she can unmute and speak.
Okay.
And we can go back and forth. But go ahead.
So another one was, under what guidance does the child have with regard to in-person ESY if a parent does not want to send to school but wants services in the home instead?
I would look to, first of all, I would find out if your child's school district does have in-person ESY. Because even though the governor came out and said the schools can open for ESY, most schools are not doing that. Okay, so what the argument that you would have, first I would look to find out whether your school is actually opening for ESY. If so, then I would talk to the doctor about whether it's risky to send your child to school and have them write a letter as to the reasons why they shouldn't be going to the school building quite yet. And then you'd then have an argument that while because of your child's unique needs, they could get access to their education if somebody were to come to the home, but because of their needs they can't go into the school building, and then the district would have to provide that.
Okay, and one more. My child is in a self-contained classroom. Do you think he'll have a school BCBA as well?
Yes, every school district should have a BCBA. Okay, so if they don't, they're contracting with somebody. So it doesn't, every school district should have a BCBA. If your child is in an autism class, it's specifically if they're providing ABA services, it's not ABA if it's not being overseen by a BCBA. That's required. And they're also, and because they have to do the analysis. So you have to make sure, so especially if your child's in an ABA program, it's likely being overseen by a BCBA. If not, it's not a true ABA program.
Okay, that's all.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sure. So the follow-up to that is, if your child hasn't been receiving an appropriate education, if they haven't been making progress during this time, then you would be entitled to, your child would likely be entitled to compensatory education for the IEP services that haven't been provided or maybe reduced or weren't effective. So the IEP team is supposed to determine whether compensatory education will be provided, but you do have the right to challenge it if the district says no and you disagree. I would be surprised if school districts, I'm not going to say it's impossible, I would be surprised though if school districts truly take a position that no compensatory education is due under these circumstances. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I'd be surprised. So if your child's IEP said that they should be receiving speech and language 3 times a week for 30 minutes, and then when it changed to virtual instruction, it switched to like they maybe reduced it to maybe twice a week for 20 minutes, the school district has an obligation to make up for that lost time because they weren't provided with, they weren't implementing the IEP as written. The argument is that school districts said, this is what your child needs in order to receive FAPE. Now we're saying we're not going to provide it. So that's an issue. Okay. So I just want to see one thing. Okay. So if they're saying that they're not going to that they weren't providing it now, then there's a really strong argument that your child wasn't receiving FAPE and they have to make up for the services. I will recognize, and it's just something to think about, that that children are going to have a hard time going back to school. They're likely going to be very tired when they like at the end of a school day, and so you have to think about, when will the compensatory education be provided? It can be provided over the summer. You can get money to provide the services privately. There's no specific guidance on how the compensatory education has to be delivered. That's really up to your child's unique needs. So you can be creative in terms of how it's going to be provided if your child is having difficulty accessing it, or you think that the way the district is deciding that comp ed should be provided isn't appropriate. If it's not going to make a difference, then you should challenge that and say, no, this is how it should be provided in order to ensure that your child receives FAPE. So if you have an issue with compensatory education later on, and the IEP team decides your child's not getting it or you disagree, you do have the right to file a petition for a mediation and or due process to try to prove to a judge that you're entitled to compensatory education. When you file a due process petition, it doesn't always get to a judge. Often the cases settle ahead of time. You can do it by yourself. You can have an attorney do it for you. But when you file these petitions, it often puts some pressure on the district to really look at your child's needs, and maybe more so than they otherwise would. And really, maybe you can work together to reach an agreement on how those services will be delivered.
I have
Okay.
a couple questions on that.
Of course.
So the first one was, and I think you sort of answered this already, when would the compensatory services be given? Compensatory services be given during summer or the fall?
Whenever. It can be provided it depends on what the services are and what you as a team decide that it should be, what should be delivered and how it can be delivered at any point.
What are the parents' responsibilities to respond to services?
I'm not sure I understand that question.
Okay, I'll follow up with it. And then we have one more here. Since the district does not have to make up on a one-to-one basis for missed therapy, do you need to justify somehow that you are recouping lost skills, not just for a season, not just a session, but for a season?
Say that one more time. I'm sorry.
So since the district does not have to make up on a one-for-one basis for missed therapy, do you need to justify somehow that you are recouping lost skills?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So if they're not, you have to show that your child has regressed or hasn't made progress. So the way you do that is you look at the data. So that's why I'm suggesting that you go back, you ask their teachers and the BCBAs for the data that was collected before your child went on virtual. So you can see where they were and where they are now. You might be able to do an updated assessment to compare. These are different ways of finding out whether your child has regressed, or just by taking videos. You can take videos of how they're performing and show it to the district to document whether if your child has regressed or how they're performing. So go ahead, sorry.
I got to follow up. Do parents need documentation they did not receive services? Or if the parents choose not to engage in the offered services, would they still be able to request compensatory services?
So if your child, do you need documentation to show that in order to receive comp ed? I'm going to have to say it depends on the district. It's going to be hard to say that you're not going to be provided officially with documentation that services weren't provided, but they have an obligation to document when they were provided. So if you don't have any documentation that it wasn't provided, it will probably be, I think you should ask the school district for the documentation that was collected or the data that was collected to show that it was provided, and then you do a comparison to make up for the services that should have been provided during that time. And your second question, I'm sorry?
Yes. So I just got another one. The second part of that one was if the parent chooses not to engage in the offered services, would they still be able to request compensatory services?
It depends on the services that the parent rejected. If you rejected services like the district tried to offer virtual instruction over, the teacher tried to come on video and you opted not to do it because your child was giving you a hard time during it, then yeah, you should be able to request compensatory education. If you turned it down because you had to work, I don't know that the law is clear on that yet. We don't have enough guidance, and this is the first time this has happened. So I think that that's going to be a tough argument or more of an uphill battle to say that you're entitled to comp ed because you had to work. But on the flip side, your child has rights. So your child can say, well, I should have been entitled to it in spite of the fact that my mom had to work. It just didn't, or my dad had to work. So I think there's an argument there, but there's not a clear-cut answer.
Okay, and we have just one more. It kind of goes back to the previous slide of the BCBA. I was able to teach my child while at home, and the teacher provided a new VB, which shows progress. Do I still need other data from the school district?
I would certainly ask for more data from the school district just to confirm how your child was doing.
Okay, great. That's all we have so far.
So this slide was really applied. I just wanted to put it up there because this is what Betsy DeVos said about whether they were going to waive any type of regulation or any part of the IDEA or Section 504 during this time. They said that they're not waiving it. She came out with an explicit statement, and this is a statement that they are not requesting a waiver authority so whether districts have an obligation to provide certain services under the IDEA and 504, which means they have an obligation to provide, to ensure that your child is receiving FAPE. They have an obligation to evaluate. They have an obligation to evaluate to the maximum extent that they can within the timeframes prescribed in the law. So there are some evaluations that cannot be done over a computer because of their protocols. That really goes to the educational evaluation and psychological evaluation. But speech and language evaluations, there are components of the speech and language evaluation that can be done virtually. And there are speech and language providers that are implementing those, or they're administering those tests virtually. Beyond Communications and Princeton Speech and Language are both speech and language providers that are doing it virtually. If you are listening to this presentation or you know of another provider, please let me know, because I always want to share with clients or the public that you are also providing virtual instruction or doing the assessments virtually. So if school districts are saying, if your child is up for an evaluation and school districts comes back and says, well, we're not doing that evaluation right now, and particularly with speech, then I would ask for an independent evaluation, because you're not waiving the timelines that they're required to abide by, because it can be done virtually. They're just choosing not to. So and if they say, well, speech and language can't be done virtually either, well, ASHA, which is the board that governs speech and hearing pathologists, says, yeah, no, it can be done virtually. So I would go onto the ASHA website, ASHA, and print out their documentation that says it can be done virtually. There are also other assessments that can be done virtually, but certain components of an educational evaluation, but it is pretty limited. So speech and language it's pretty clear cut that can be done virtually, and I wouldn't waive it. I would make sure that the district pays for it if they're not going to do it on their own. So this is where, I don't know if we have any students or families on here where a child was going from early intervention to Part B, which is with preschool and kindergarten. But there were a lot of concerns about what they would be entitled to when they transition to the preschool and kindergarten age period from early intervention. What the guidance was that early intervention had to continue providing the services, but the school districts would pay for it. So to minimize any type of transition issues. So that is the guidance that came out with respect to that. They should continue to be evaluated at this point now that schools are opening up, but if they're not, the services should continue and the school district should be paying for it. So with regard to evaluations, school districts have an obligation to evaluate all areas of your child's suspected disability. And there are different evaluations that would be done to determine whether your child is eligible for special education and related services. Some of those evaluations would be, if your child is on the autism spectrum, some of your evaluations would be an educational evaluation, a psychological evaluation, a speech and language evaluation. And speech and language should not just be for articulation. You want to make sure that they're addressing the language component too. It's sometimes the speech and language evaluations really focused on articulation. And I hear lots of parents saying, well, my child doesn't have any articulation issues, so they don't need speech. If they're autistic, then they have a language issue, in which case they would be entitled to speech and language to address the language component. So I really would make sure that the speech and language evaluation focuses on that. Same thing for an occupational therapy evaluation. It's not just shoe tying, it's not just handwriting, it's also for sensory needs. So I would make sure that the evaluation addresses that as well. Physical therapy, their ability to write, their ability to navigate a building. So that's an evaluation that would be warranted under certain circumstances as well. So you really want to look into, you want to make sure that your child is evaluated in all areas of the suspected disability. And if your child is initially being evaluated, meaning that they've never been evaluated before and they've never been deemed eligible before, the district has 90 days to complete that evaluation. And if it's a reevaluation, which is required to be done every 3 years, the district has 60 days to complete that reevaluation. So these are the timelines, and to the extent that they can meet those timelines, and they're required to do so. And if they can't do it because they can't meet in person, which is not really the case now, then you do have the right to mutually waive it. But I would set a timeline on when that's going to occur. So, Jenny, did you have a question?
Yes, we have a few again.
Okay.
Can you ask for an independent eval if the district hasn't had the chance to do theirs initially?
If you give them an opportunity and they say no, then that's their opportunity to do the evaluation. So that there's an argument there to say, well, you had an opportunity, you chose not to do it, and therefore we're asking for an independent evaluation at the district's expense. So if they're not doing it because it can't be done virtually anywhere, that's a different conversation. If it can be done virtually and they're just choosing not to, I think that's a rationale for saying you should be entitled to an independent.
This is from the one who was asking about the BCBAs. She did what you said and she reached out immediately right now.
Great.
And the teacher got back to her and claimed that the BCBAs have met with my child, but no negative behavior that needs to be worked upon in school. She said she only takes data on decreasing hitting, spitting, and escape from work. So what data do I need to ask for in this situation?
Skills, data on skill development, skill progression.
Okay, we have another one. We are moving pre-K to CSEK. Is there any chance for pendency?
Yes, under Pardini, under the Pardini versus Allegheny decision.
Okay, and one more. What if the district won't give an individual speech for language in a high-functioning ASD child-only group? Is there any resource?
It depends on your child's needs. I don't know why they're refusing to do individual. If your child is not making progress in group, then you'd have an argument to get individual. And if they disagree, ask for an evaluation, and then get an independent evaluation to hopefully bridge the parties together.
They got back immediately and just said they see no need.
For data?
No, for the previous one about the individual speech for language.
Oh, I don't. So then I would request an evaluation to assess the needs.
Okay. And then another one just came in that said, can you repeat the state versus Allegheny? Is that what it is?
Pardini versus Allegheny School District.
Yes. Can you repeat that?
If your child is going from early intervention to preschool eligibility and they're not and you disagree that the program is appropriate, then if you file for mediation and due process, then they would be entitled to, they have to maintain the current program until the dispute is resolved. And that is under the Pardini versus Allegheny decision.
Okay, that's all so far.
Okay. So I mentioned the timelines. That's the 9. So and we already went over that. And then we also talked about the first two. So it's the last part on this particular slide is that after the evaluations are done, the district will schedule an eligibility meeting and an IEP meeting. So the eligibility meeting is a meeting to determine whether a child is eligible for special education and related services. And if they are eligible, then they would likely move into an IEP meeting to develop that IEP right then and there. Your child would be eligible for an IEP if they meet 3 prongs. The first prong is that they have a disability, and in this case, because I'm going to assume it's autism because of the purpose of this group, but they could have other disabilities. So if they have autism, then does their disability adversely impact their ability to learn? Not just with academics. We're talking about other areas as well. So if their disability adversely impacts their ability to learn from their peers or exchange ideas from their peers, then because of their social skills deficits, then that adversely impacts their ability to learn. Okay, so the first prong is they have a disability. The second prong is that it adversely impacts their ability to learn. And the third prong is that they require specially designed instruction to benefit from their education. And the third prong, specially designed instruction, which is the third prong, is any instruction that's different from their gen ed instruction. So if they require individual speech and language, or they require a certain methodology like ABA or floor time, that's different from the general education program. So they would be entitled to an IEP because they meet those 3 prongs. So a lot of, I frequently hear districts telling parents that reevaluations are not necessary because they know that their child is otherwise eligible. I would say do it anyway, okay? It's not just to determine eligibility. There are other reasons which have been outlined here to do reevaluations. And the biggest one is to make sure your child is making progress. Okay, you don't want to rely on evaluation that's 6 years old when you're developing IEPs. You want to make sure that your child's making progress, and the way to do that is to reevaluate. And sometimes it's administering the same assessment 3 years later. Other times you're changing the assessment to do something that's more age appropriate, or maybe you're adding an assessment. But I really want to emphasize that it's not a good idea to waive reevaluations. If the district comes to you and tells you that they think that they don't want to reevaluate because they're concerned that your child won't be eligible again, don't let that scare you. I've heard that one too, and especially when you're coming back into school and teams are getting busier and busier, they might throw that idea at you. Don't let that scare you. I would really do the reevaluations, and if for some reason, which I highly doubt would be the case, but if they do come back and say that your child is no longer eligible for an IEP, then you have the right to file for mediation and due process and invoke the stay put provision, which means they can't change the eligibility until the dispute is resolved. So I would really make sure that you do the reevaluations. Please don't waive them, especially during this time period, because you want to see if your child is making progress or if they've regressed. And evaluations are a really great way of doing that. Okay, so the IEP, I kind of went over the slide throughout the presentation, but I'm just going to go over it again. FAPE must be provided. It still has to be designed to enable your child to receive an appropriate education. During COVID-19, it's according to the guidance memos are all on my website, by the way. If you have trouble accessing them somewhere else, they're all on my website. You just click on the home page on the top banner, it will take you right to the memos. But it says that schools must ensure that to the greatest extent possible, the students receive the special education and related services in the IEP. But it doesn't mean that they're not entitled to an education later if they've been providing services to their greatest extent possible. They need to provide it to the greatest extent possible now, with an understanding that they will make up the services that weren't provided later on through compensatory education. The last question that is really coming up now is, what about those students who are aging out or supposed to be graduating this year if they haven't been receiving services during this time period or they've regressed? As you may know, if your child has an IEP, they could be entitled to an education until June following their 21st birthday. Okay, so they should not graduate earlier. If your child is going to need other services like DDD services, they should stay in school until June following their 21st birthday. If they are aging out, meaning that they're ready to graduate, or they're ready because they've reached their 21st birthday, and they haven't been receiving services, the law, they came out with guidance, what's today, Sunday, they came out with guidance on Friday on this particular issue. And it's pretty clear that that school districts, while they can't keep your child in school theoretically under the IDEA because they've aged out, the teams should and are encouraged to consider whether there's a need for compensatory education to make up for the services they should have been providing during this time period. So if your child is aging out and they're no longer going to be in the school district, contact your case manager, ask for an IEP meeting now to determine whether the compensatory education will be provided. And if they say it's not going to be provided, I would encourage you to file for due process as soon as possible to get those services delivered. So you wouldn't be entitled to stay put per se, but under this provision, if your child is aging out, if they're younger than 21, then they could be. But if they're older than 21 or they've reached their 21st birthday, they're not entitled to stay put, but you can file for due process to get compensatory education if the district won't do it voluntarily. So when you're challenging the school district, you're entitled, this would be the process. Sometimes the ways of resolving the dispute are to ask to either get evaluations on your own or to ask for the district to pay for evaluations for a provider that you choose. And maybe you can come together after that evaluation comes back and discuss how to address whatever needs have been identified in the evaluation. If the district has just not been complying with the IEP, you can file a complaint investigation. And that's a complaint investigation you file with the Department of Education, and then they review. The Department of Ed will investigate to determine whether services have been provided. If not, they'll force the district to provide the services at no charge to you. You don't go to a judge, it's at no charge to you. And you can do this if it's clear cut. The IEP calls for certain services, they haven't been providing it. And then you file the complaint and investigation. If your argument is that the IEP is not appropriate, or your child isn't making progress, you can't do it through a complaint investigation. You have to do it through a petition for a mediation or a petition for mediation and due process. So if you're arguing over the ambiguous term of what is appropriate, you do it through the petition for mediation or mediation and due process. But a complaint investigation is clear cut. The IEP calls for something and they're not providing it. So therefore you're filing this with the Department of Ed to force them to comply at no charge to you. So if you have any questions, let me know. Jenny, were there any other questions?
Yeah, there were a few.
Okay.
Can you re-explain how to fight for speech evaluations and services?
So really there are different arguments on how to advocate for speech and language services. First, you look at the evaluation that was done by the school district. Did it evaluate in all areas of the suspected disability? So one example would be, did they advocate for, did they evaluate for articulation needs? Did they evaluate for communication needs, social skills, emotional development, but pragmatics, expressive language, receptive language, written language? If it didn't do that, then you can ask for an independent evaluation, which is an evaluation that's done by an independent provider at the district's expense. So if that would be the way of asking for an independent evaluation. And then if they refuse to do that, to grant the evaluation, they're required to file a petition for due process against you to show that their evaluation is appropriate. Districts are going back and forth on whether every district varies on their approach with respect to that, but that would be the way of advocating for it.
Okay, I have one more here. With regard to private testing, is it best to have the private ones done before the triannual evals?
If you're definitely going to pay for it yourself, then probably, yeah, because then your evaluator will dictate what assessments are used, and then you can determine whether any other assessments are needed to determine whether your child is eligible for certain services and what goes into the IEP.
That's all I have here.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
That was fantastic, Hillary. A lot of information. as always. I wanted to just, you commented about the triannual evaluation and somebody mentioned it there. So I just wanted you to kind of speak to what are the components of that, because you made a very valid point years ago. I'll share my personal story. Years ago, when we were due for the triannual eval, every 3 years, the district suggested that, maybe we should waive it.
Right.
And I'm so glad that I had heard somewhere that never ever waive it. And that was the best decision we made, because they were able to uncover that there are a lot of issues going on with Nicholas. And that really enabled us to seek a better placement for him.
Mm-hmm.
If we hadn't done that assessment and eval, we would have been stuck in the placement that we were in at that time. So I wanted you to comment a little bit about how crucial that is and what are the components of that, because some people are new. They may never even knew that there's such a thing as a triannual evaluation.
Oh, okay, that's fair. So the district is required to evaluate a student's needs in all areas of the suspected disability. So they would do the evaluations. They usually do it in educational evaluations. If your child is nonverbal, then they should be administering an evaluation for students who are nonverbal. There's a test of nonverbal intelligence. There's a peak assessment, which I love. Rebecca and I have both been certified in it. I don't administer it, but I'm very familiar with it. And I don't get any money to promote it either. But it's just an evaluation that really identifies whether your child has the prerequisite skills to learn the goals that are in your child's IEP. And it goes everywhere from life skills to calculus. So there's research, a lot of research behind it, specifically to evaluate individuals with developmental disabilities such as autism. So your child might not need or it might not be appropriate to administer a WISC or a Woodcock-Johnson, which is an educational evaluation and a psychological evaluation that they would give to gen ed students. But it could be, but it might not be. You shouldn't just give up on that evaluation, because there are evaluations that are research-based to evaluate the needs of your child and their abilities of your child with autism. So basically, you want to make sure that you're going to have an evaluation planning meeting, and you're going to outline what evaluations will be done: an educational, a psychological, maybe the peak assessment, a speech and language, not just for articulation. You want to specify that you're asking for pragmatics and social skills as well. So you want to make sure that it's addressing language. Okay, maybe an occupational therapy evaluation, maybe a neurological evaluation, maybe a psychiatric evaluation if your child has anxiety or has a lot of behaviors. So you want to you want to ask the team to administer all of these different evaluations. And those evaluations do have to be done every 3 years. They can be done more often if deemed necessary, but at a minimum, they're required to do it every 3 years. And if they don't want to do it, then you can ask for an independent evaluation, which are evaluations that are administered at the district's expense by somebody who does not work for the district.
So that's a great comment. My question is, how does a parent know what evaluations to ask for? Because you listed all these things. Is there information somewhere that you can look at? And half of the time, by the time they do these evaluations and the results come back, they use these fancy language that I've looked at some of those results. I don't know about how the parents on here. And I'm like, I don't even know what this means. So how do we break this down so people know what to ask for that's appropriate?
Well, the Facebook groups and these support groups are really helpful with respect to making recommendations as to what you should be asking for. So going to the parent support groups, a lot of parents exchange ideas. Going on Facebook and looking at comments, or even asking other parents what they've done, is a great way. Another great way is talking to your developmental pediatrician, or your neurologist, to ask for recommendations on what evaluations should be done. So there are lots of different resources available. I'm always happy to help as well to determine what your child needs are. But if they're autistic, a speech and language evaluation is first and foremost. They should always be doing that.
Right. No, that's great, because I think that's an area that most of us fail to appreciate. And I also wanted to comment, because I know there's a number of us on here whose children may be aging out soon. So even along the lines of the value or how these evaluations help towards guardianship, for example, the value of that for DDD, can you comment on that for those parents that are in that category?
Yeah, that's great. So when your child turns 18, they might be in need of a guardian, which is so when your child turns 18, they're legally an adult, but because of their disability, they can't make decisions by themselves or on their own. They can't maybe manage their own money or talk to doctors. So parents have to go to court to get permission to continue advocating for your child with special needs. And that's the process is called guardianship. So part of that process is demonstrating to the court that your child has disabilities that will impact their ability to advocate for themselves and take care of themselves. And that information can come out of these evaluations that the district does. Also, DDD, the Division of Developmental Disabilities, that's a state agency that provides services for children, for now adults, when they age out of the school district at 21. Okay, it's very difficult to get services before that. That's through a different agency before that. But when they turn 21, they can get adult services such as maybe job support, maybe a day program, maybe money to develop your own program, maybe money for residential housing, or maybe they place your child in a group home or a supervised apartment. But DDD is a state agency that provides services to adults with disabilities. But you have to demonstrate that your child is eligible for supports, for DDD services. And in order to prove that your child is eligible, one way is to go back to the evaluations that were done by the school district. And if you don't do that, or if they're not clear enough, if they're not comprehensive enough, then you're going to have to pay for it on your own if your child is aged out. So there's a huge benefit to making sure that the school district does the comprehensive evaluation around the 18-19 timeframe, so you can use that when you're applying for services from DDD.
Right,
That's a long explanation, but I felt like I needed to do some background for that.
No, that's perfect, because that really was crucial. I know that last year when we were going through our timing, you were very helpful with timelines. And, even when we had to now apply to SSI, some of that information was so seamless. I just took that information, attached it. I didn't have to do a whole lot of stuff. So I'm really glad that you mentioned the 18, 19-year-old time frame, because a lot of parents just wake up to it and all of a sudden the child is 21 and have no idea what to do. With that respect.
Genevieve, we're getting a lot of pushback, or I'm seeing a lot of parents getting pushback on SSI eligibility when they apply for services for SSI when their child turns 18. And for some of you, you might know that your child is eligible for SSI if they make less than a certain amount in monthly income, $910 a month, and they have less than $2,000 in resources. But that's not the reason that they're getting turned down for SSI. Now the government is Social Security Administration is turning them down because they're saying that they don't meet the criteria of having a severe enough disability. And it's all of a sudden they're getting a lot of pushback, which tells, I have my various theories on it, but a lot of parents are getting pushback on SSI eligibility, which means that they're going to now get pushback on Medicaid eligibility. So it's really even that much more important for the evaluations and the IEPs to document how the disability impacts their ability to function in life and to work, and will prevent them from working. Because if it doesn't, then they'll likely be turned down for SSI at this point.
Yeah, and maybe that's another topic we can do with you, because we applied, and within a year we had to reestablish again why he needed it. And, it really is crucial from the Medicaid standpoint to be able to get services. So having somebody be able to come in a home. We're in the COVID season right now. You talked about how, school is expecting us to deliver the services that they normally would do in school. Right. And as a parent, who's going to do that? And so if you do have somebody that you can support to come into the home and do that, that's where this Medicaid and SSI eligibility stuff helps. And so, we want to that's why I'm bringing it up to these parents. Please, please, please know how important. Take time and get these things done. Those are some things that otherwise you will lose sleep when you
Right.
don't have your documentation. And I know that we were able to provide all the documentation that's necessary because we've kept records and we've made sure that we, every time we need to do something, we got it done. Take
Right.
time off from work and make that a priority. Last year, I shared with people that I ended up having to do FMLA just so that I had days that I can just commit to just sitting there and reading through the material. We take time off for, to go on vacation and do other things, which are important, but for your children's education, this is really crucial. So that was one thing that I just wanted to add to that conversation. You said something earlier too that I thought was really interesting, which for Nick, who's severely affected, the value of including within the IEP, social skills, development, emotional, activities of daily living. A lot of parents focus on just academics. Can you just comment about the importance of that as well? Because I think that's really important.
Yeah. So it is, I mean, it's vital. So if your child has an autism diagnosis, there's a ton of research to suggest that they've experienced some sort of trauma in their life. It might not be something traumatic that you would or I would say should be traumatic, but it was traumatic for them. So it's important to address anxiety and change the program and approach your child's program in a trauma-informed method, or a trauma-informed approach. So you can assume, you might not be able to identify what that traumatic event was, but it's important to approach their program as though it's from a trauma-informed approach. So assuming that they have experienced a traumatic event in some way. And so when doing these evaluations, you're evaluating the child to determine, if they're not engaging, if they're not interacting with other people, is it because they don't know how to? Is it because they're afraid? We can't assume that they just don't want to. I don't think that this is a fair assumption. I think that most of the time, there's tons of research behind what I'm saying. There's a lot of research to suggest that students with autism want to socialize, they just don't know how to. So they need that direct instruction to teach them those skills. So they can interact in a socially appropriate way. But again, it has to be done from a trauma-informed approach. So it's just, having these evaluations to identify what skills they have, you'll be able to then develop a program, maybe combined with the help of a BCBA, to develop a program to teach them the skills, from the fundamental skills to then teaching them skills to generalize the skills across environments. That is incredibly important. And just to hammer that home, if school districts will tell you that they don't do that here, that's just totally false. I don't even know of a less direct way of saying that. You have the core curriculum content standards that talk about that they address speech and language, social skills, language skills, communication skills. You also have the school districts, when communication is just a fundamental skill to being independent in life. So if, for Genevieve, when we're talking, I can be learning from you, right? If I'm not just learning from a teacher, you could be learning from me, I could be learning from you. If I'm not able to engage in that dialogue, it's preventing me from learning from you. Okay. And teachers have group activities. So students can exchange ideas, and if they can't communicate, they can't learn from their peers and exchange ideas with their peers. So those are just different arguments as to why your child really needs to learn these skills so they can access and benefit from their education.
Wow. That is wonderful. I mean, we've gotten a lot of great feedback from people loving what you're sharing. And
Great, I made it all up.
So we want to say thank you so much for your Sunday afternoon, just making time here to do this for our families. Please leverage contact. She has her website here, her number is also listed on here. Please feel free to reach out if you don't struggle. I know that I've had to go the route of, before I connected with Hillary, of the route of consulting another special ed attorney. That helped, just having that conversation. He spent $300 to go into his office, but it was worth every dime of it, because he pointed out things that I could be doing. I didn't end up having to go to court or anything like that, because he was able to point out things that we could be doing that can strengthen our case for what we were arguing for. So it just goes to tell you that it is so important that we make time. Let's make the time to learn and, be educated about things that, we're needing to do. So at this time, I want to encourage all of you. We just posted the survey link because we want to be able to give feedback to Hillary. What's one thing you learned today? So for those of you who are on the Zoom with us, you can, if you want to share your video, just and want to say something, one thing you learned or something that you are empowered to do differently as you leave this line. That'd be great for feedback for her while she's here. But we also can offer you that the ability to anonymously give us your response to this time here with us. So for us brave parents that are on here that want to share, what's one thing you've learned today that you just want to just give us a feedback about? Who wants to say anything? All right. All these brave souls that are hiding behind your pictures, that's fine. You're looking very beautiful. But I know there's a lot of questions that had been asked of you, and we're so grateful for your time. We left the survey link there. We'll send it to everyone as well too. But what if it's something that you learn or more questions about it, or something that Hillary said that you just said, I want to know more about it? We will love to ask her to come back another time. Somebody just made a comment here that they learned that 504 is a great resource. It's not as minor as I previously viewed it. So yeah, that slide was really, really crucial, the importance of that, because most people think is the only people who have the quote unquote power is those who have IEPs, and didn't really realize that. And so we also want to know about the college process for individual with child with a disability. So maybe that's something we can talk about, really how to prepare for that, because most people think that a child, just because they have a disability or they have an IEP or 504, are not ineligible to go to college. But I know a lot has changed now. So
I did have one question here, Hillary. Are IQ tests necessary for children on the spectrum? Also, Vineland test. Her son's teacher said they have not done an IQ test on him.
No, it's not necessary if they otherwise know their child's needs. They can do it, but it's not required.
Okay, excellent. All right, so Hillary, any parting words for our families that are here? You have quite a number of people who have logged in and listened to every word dripping out of your mouth.
So I just appreciate you all spending the time to listen today. I hope you learned something, and I really do hope everybody is happy and healthy and getting through this during this time. So it's a difficult time, but I'm always here if you have any questions. I'm happy to help in any way I can.
Absolutely. And so remember, the transition period for your child and thinking about the future is from the age of 14. That should be part of the conversations that your child study team should be having with you. And that really looks about the future. And so if there are questions about what's going to happen with them, there are other ways. It's not always 100% guardianship. There are other things you can do as well too. So these are some of the things that we'll ask, the next time Hillary comes back, to kind of share, because I know there's a lot of people who have questions about that and don't know quite what to do. So these are all areas that we can dive in a little bit more. But on that note, thank you so much for your time. And we really appreciate you. Every feedback that we've been getting privately is that this is a wonderful presentation, as always. I did promise everyone that she will not disappoint, and she did.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Have a great one, everyone.
You too. Bye.